My name is Jonathan Poritz. I've retired from two careers over many years, one as a professor of mathematics and computer science, another in parallel working in various companies and research centers on cryptology, artificial intelligence, and quantum computation. These days, I think of myself as a gig worker in the open education movement.
And my name is Kathy Giuffre. I'm a retired professor of sociology. I spent 30 years researching and teaching about communities, networks, social movements, and collective action.
It often seems like today the world is going through a kind of slow apocalypse, with genocidal violence, devastating climate change, global pandemic, and on and on and on, all horribly exacerbated by an awful rightward trend in politics in so many nations. As people who want to do something to make the world a better place, we have found it hard not to despair. But then we remembered that our various careers and lives have given us tools which we find useful and which we hope may be useful to you as we try to resist the slide into dystopia.
So what are we talking about today, Jonathan?
We're going to talk in this episode about education, which is deeply under threat in the United States at this moment. And the lens we're going to use is that of something called open education. I think the reason to do this is that open education is an example of a certain kind of resistance that may be one of the ways we can do good going forward.
So it seems to me that one of the big things going on in the United States right now is the attempt to completely derail education so that an ignorant populace is very easy to control.
I think that's a really valid point. I think the attack on education has roots that go a fair bit back in the United States. And I think it's worthwhile to think a little bit about some of those roots and then to talk about this idea of open education, which is one way that has been, I think, quite successful in the last few years before the recent rise of fascism and authoritarianism to combat problems in education. First of all, I think that education is of great value to people and to their societies. The benefits to people, of course, include higher lifetime earnings, the ability to get jobs which are less dangerous or which have better benefits. There are some interesting statistics about how people who have got advanced degrees have total lifetime income, which is more than $1 million more than people who have just a high school diploma. And there are various different ways of computing these numbers, but it seems like there's a great deal of financial incentive. So this financial incentive also is something that was explored by the sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom in a book of hers from 2017 called Lower Ed. She was looking at for-profit higher education in the United States, and what she found was a lot of people in the United States who have, say, a frontline job in some store or in fast food or in some relatively blue-collar type job and who want to get advanced in their job, and they want to be the manager of the franchise where they're working, or they want to look for another job that has slightly better conditions, better salary, better stability. Often there's a requirement for getting those other kinds of jobs, which is just you must have some form of advanced degree. And people get to a certain point in their lives in the United States and they say, well, I want to move on in my life and I need just to be able to successfully get past the first screening of HR at this next place I want to apply for a job, I need to have an advanced degree. And what she found was the people who do that then immediately go, and the first bit of advertisement they run into often is for a for-profit community college, and they offer a quick way to get an associate's degree, and people immediately act on that. So this, I think, says something about the dynamics of education in the United States. It's a necessary step to get a career advancement, and it is viewed as building people's saleability in the marketplace and as part of the sort of modern version of capitalism that we have in the United States, which is neoliberal capitalism, which is a version of capitalism, unlike classical liberalism, taking it back to people like Locke and Rousseau. The neoliberal capitalism is really fundamentalist on the idea of markets, and it makes us think that everything is a market, and so individuals are preparing themselves for a market, and they make investments in themselves the way a business might seek to borrow money from potential investors in order to expand its business operations. And that's the way people are thinking now about education. You borrow money to invest in your future as a business, as a market, actually as a person, by getting some credential which you will then reap personal benefits for. So with this neoliberal vision of what the job market is and life is in the United States, it becomes very natural to think of education as a thing which is only a benefit to the individual.
So it's like a commodity. You invest in yourself, you buy this commodity, and then because you bought it, you have a better outcome in terms of jobs you can get and lifestyle and things like that.
Exactly. That has been something which has infected public policy about education in the United States during this current moment of the rise of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, by the way, is sort of the fundamental ideology, I would say, of old school conservatives, people like Mitt Romney in the Republican Party who were called financial or economic conservatives, unlike the current Christo-fascist authoritarian Republican Party.
I just want to make the point that liberalism here does not mean progressive politics. It's actually the opposite of that. It's a sort of free market thing rather than what we think, oh, they're owning the libs. This is not the same kind of liberalism.
Absolutely. And neoliberalism doesn't mean a new form of liberalism exactly. It's not the left versus the right, the liberals versus the conservative. It's an idea that dates from the beginning of the modern era when the divine right of kings was being questioned and we need a new way to structure societies, and the idea of having a marketplace was an alternative to aristocracies, and that's what people like Adam Smith and John Locke proposed. And that's what I'm calling classical liberalism, not versus left versus right. It's liberalism in that sense, and neoliberalism is a more fundamentalist version focused on markets that's been taking place in the modern world.
So it's a much more conservative ideology in the world today.
Absolutely. And what one hears sometimes people talk about neoliberalism as late-stage capitalism. It's the decrepit exaggeration of capitalism in all ways. There's a wonderful book about this called Undoing the Demos by the political scientist Wendy Brown that I think analyzes how neoliberalism has played out in recent decades in the United States.
So how does this intersect with education?
Well, that's a good point. So if you're starting to think, and if it's becoming the social norm of thinking about education as this investment, as you're saying, you're investing in yourself as a commodity, then why is the public supporting you as a business person or as a business almost, a commodity, getting this advancement? And so there was a movement to reduce public spending on public higher education in the United States. We haven't yet completely cut away K through 12 education in the United States, but
although we're working on that.
Although we're working on it, absolutely. And the vouchers program and so on are a way of destroying K through 12 education in the United States. But public higher education, I would argue, doesn't really exist anymore. Because when you think about the phrase public higher education, what do you think? You think people getting higher education, public means that the majority of the funding for that should come from the public coffers. That has actually stopped in the United States.
So this would be like state universities, the great
Absolutely.
State universities, University of North Carolina, University of Pennsylvania, University of Arkansas.
And aside from those examples of the great university systems, which I think are wonderful institutions, but it's an interesting fact that doesn't seem to have made it into the public consciousness about education in the United States is that the majority of students pursuing higher education in the United States, by numbers, are going to get a community college degree. The majority of students in higher education are getting community college degrees. The majority of students who are getting a 4-year degree are not at the big famous states institutions like the ones you just mentioned, but are at regional 4-year comprehensive institutions. And then there are many large research and teaching-oriented institutions like the ones you named, and then there are, of course, a small number of private institutions that have a lot of fame and wealth. The graph I'm going to show here now is an interesting graph from, I found one that shows from the period from 2002 to 2016. It shows two sources of revenue for the institutions, public higher education institutions, one of them being tuition income and the other being state money being given to those institutions, what we think of as the source of major funding for a public higher education institution. In fact, as this graph shows, there's a steady trend up in the tuition that is charged to students, and there's a steady trend down in state appropriations being given to institutions. The two lines cross at around 2009. These are nationwide averages of expenditures for these state institutions. It started out that tuition was a little more than half of the amount of money that was then given by the state, and now it is past tuition is about 1.5 times the amount which is provided by the state. So I would argue that there is no such thing in the United States anymore as public higher education. So this is obviously something that's put on the backs of students an enormous burden that they want to pursue this neoliberal goal of bettering the commodity they're going to offer on the marketplace, or they want to pursue a liberal arts education, educate themselves towards in the things that matter to be a free person, as in the origin of the phrase liberal arts education. Things get even worse, though, when you think a little bit more. There are interactions with other aspects of the American economy over the last few decades, and one of them is that many industries have concentrated, and the end of enforcing antitrust law has been happening also since Ronald Reagan. And as a consequence, what we have is that in the textbook publishing industry in the United States, there are about 5 major publishers that publish the majority of textbooks that are used in higher education in the United States. And as always, when there's an oligopoly, there is little competition. The prices tend to start shooting higher up. I would argue that for textbooks, there's a lesson to be held about the problems with capitalism in general, because who is it who picks the commodity that has to be purchased? The textbook commodity is the professors, and sometimes a committee of professors for a large course which has many sections. And who is it who pays for that commodity? It is the students. They have no choice. They have to buy the textbook that their professors choose. So there's a broken feedback cycle between the purchaser and the provider. And there's no incentive to the providers to reduce the prices on them. As long as they can convince the professors to require their particular textbooks, it doesn't matter how expensive they are, the students will have to buy those books in order to be successful as students. Here's a graph that I want to show as a consequence of those various things that I was pointing out about the textbook market in the United States. This begins in 1980 and comes up to 2025. It's a graph I made actually with Bureau of Labor Statistics data. And what it shows is the increase in percent since 1980. That's just an arbitrary baseline I chose. One curve is a very steady straight line, increasing slowly, starting at 0. That was the increase, the baseline was 1980, and it gets up to around 250%. This is the total amount of inflation since 1980.
So that's this orange-yellow line here.
That's right, and it's also known as the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. The other thing that's interesting to look at is above the Consumer Price Index is a purple curve, which is rising steadily, always higher than the Consumer Price Index. In fact, it seems like it's twice as high and growing more and more until in around 2017, it maxes out at around 900%. So there's been an increase in the cost of textbooks from 1980 to now of 900%.
So the purple line is the cost of textbooks.
That's exactly right. And so I compared it to the cost of inflation to show, yes, textbooks are more expensive than they were in 1980. And that's not just inflation. In fact, it's many, many times. It's more than 4 times the amount that prices would have increased if it was just for inflation. It's interesting that since about 2017, this curve has sort of jumped up and down a little bit, but has remained fairly steady. I think that what we're going to talk about in a second is the main reason that's been happening. There's also crazy things happening since
COVID. So it's sort of
COVID.
flattened out there at a certain point. Why?
Exactly. Well, so okay, we'll get to that in just a minute. The first thing we have to talk about is student debt, though, because this is one of the aspects, textbook prices and tuition we've talked about, and other things that are happening in student loan. The collapse of the social safety net that has been offered in the United States meant that students spending more on healthcare, childcare, everything is becoming more expensive for a student. And as a consequence, students have to borrow money to be successful as a student. So here's a graph I can show, which goes from 2006 up to 2024, and it shows the total aggregate student debt for higher education in the United States. By the way, the units of this graph are in trillions of US dollars. In 2006, the total aggregate higher education debt in the United States was around $500 billion in 2006. It's increased to be $1.7 trillion. There are other computations that push it even a little bit closer. It's roughly $2 trillion. This is a real crisis for students, and faculty who were aware of the crisis and who were concerned about this thought about it for a while and came up with an alternative. And this is an example I want to give you for this idea of open education, and I think it's an interesting example of a form of resistance that has been very effective, and I think we can continue to make it effective within education, and perhaps it's a model that can also be used on other forms of resistance. So what did these faculty do? They thought, well, the reason this expensive textbook from one of these 5 major academic textbook publishers is out there, it's a good book, I like it, I can't get it to my students without making them go to the bookstore.
Can I just ask, what kind of prices are we talking about here for these books?
Well, I taught many intro to statistics classes and calculus classes where the textbook cost is typically $200, $250, $295 for a 1-semester course in statistics, or a 2-semester course in Calc 1 and Calc 2. There are Introduction to Macroeconomics textbooks, which are $500 for a 1-semester course. There are textbooks for a course maybe that many majors who are not science majors need to take a science course. They take Introduction to Astronomy. There are Introduction to Astronomy textbooks which are pushing $200, and hundreds of thousands of students around the United States take this course every year and have to spend that money in order to pass that course in order to get their undergraduate degree.
So students are required to buy these books. They have no option. So someone, say, wants a nursing degree, for example, but they're having to buy these super expensive books because they're required to take the course and they're required to buy the book that the professor may not even know how much that book costs.
Absolutely. Now, students are very clever, and they have a variety of ways of dealing with this. Sometimes a group of students together will buy one copy of the book and share it, which, as you can see, could have impacts on a student's learning potential. The night before the exam, who's going to be able to get access to that textbook? Also, students maybe will rent a textbook. There are some bookstores or online services where you can rent the textbook and return it, not for the full price at the end of the semester. You can also buy a used copy. The publishers have tried to find end runs around all of these approaches. For example, the used market. As a math teacher, I always found hilarious that calculus has been around for hundreds of years, and there would be a new edition of a popular calculus textbook come out every 2 or 3 years, and you couldn't get the bookstore to buy an edition that no longer being printed, and therefore you had to start using the new textbook. All of page numbers, section numbers, exercise numbers were slightly changed, and so students who wanted to use a used copy floating around for much less money could not use that book. They had to buy the new one.
So this strikes me that there's another thing going on here that you haven't talked about, which is food insecurity and housing insecurity among American university students.
So that's absolutely a huge problem. There's a really interesting work on something called the Hope Center at Temple University in Philadelphia. Sarah Goldrick-Robb and other colleagues have researched this, and the numbers are really terrifying. My former institution in Colorado was similar to the national averages. We had pushing 50% of our students were housing insecure and food insecure. The numbers were a little less from year to year. Food insecure means that they were not always sure where their next meal would come from. And housing insecure likewise meant they weren't sure. They were maybe staying in some place, but they were not sure that they would be able to stay there for the long term. They might have to couch surf, to use the casual term about it. I saw this directly myself. I had a student once, he's permitted me to tell this story. I had a student once who was my student, and I saw him once working in a campus office, and I saw him eating a meal, and he was wolfing it down. I said to him, "What's that you're eating?" He said, "It's just so delicious." I said, "What's so good? Is it a new place?" He said, "No, it's just I haven't been able to eat for 3 days. So anything I eat today is going to be really delicious." And because he couldn't afford to eat every single day. So that's a thing that is a regular feature of the lives of students in the world today.
So that's really heartbreaking to me, because here are people who are making this sacrifice to go to college because they believe in this idea that has been sold to them in America, which is go to school, do your work, be a good student, get a good job, that all of this investment you're going to do is going to pay off in the future. But instead, it seems that people are being sold this bill of goods, that what they're going to get in the future actually is this massive student debt that they can never get out from under.
I totally agree. I think it's, in some sense, it's even darker than you just described it, because those total figures that I was giving you for aggregate national student debt in the United States include people who not end up getting a degree. So imagine someone who made these sacrifices and went into debt, and as you said, that cannot be escaped, and did not end up successfully finishing the degree. And so they are not able to get the career advancement that they were hoping for, and yet they nevertheless have the debt.
Because they failed their statistics class because they couldn't have access to the book.
Exactly. Very common and terrifying. All right. So let's talk about one response to this dark situation that we've been talking about, which is optimistic and was incredibly effective and can continue to be effective, and maybe is a model for other areas where we can be resistant. So a group of professors were thinking, well, why can I not get a book to my students? As I was mentioning, a calculus book has been around for a long time. Why do I have to keep using the expensive ones? Can't there be a cheaper one, maybe even a free one? I don't really want to make money off of my students that way. How about if I just write a book and give it away? And so we've talked in the past on this podcast about free and open source software that was made possible by certain licenses that allow the thing to be copied and no one gets in trouble with copyright. And the same thing can happen for educational resources. They become what are called open educational resources, or OER is the acronym. And that is where someone sits down and writes a textbook or a handbook or supplemental materials for a course or some resource that's going to be used in the classroom. And just like putting a free open source software license on a piece of software that you want to share to make the world a better place, the expert who wrote that textbook or that educational resource puts a license on it. These are called Creative Commons licenses. You put a Creative Commons license on this work that says anyone may copy this as much as they want. Copy it, distribute it, publicly perform it. Some of them also, the licenses allow you to make adaptations. So in a certain sense, these OER are better than regular textbooks. Every textbook I've ever taught out of has had typos in it. And imagine if I could get a textbook from a commercial publisher that had a significant typo at some point. I had permission to go and change it, make a new version of that textbook. You can't do that for work that's under all rights reserved copyright. But in OER, you can change it, you can adapt it. I've seen examples of a wonderful astronomy textbook used all over in the United States. It's a completely free OER because it has one of these licenses, and it's been used all over the United States. It was written in the United States. It's also been used in other places, including universities in the Southern Hemisphere, where the night sky is different. The night sky in the Southern Hemisphere is different from the Northern Hemisphere. And the faculty members who use this textbook in the Southern Hemisphere have adapted it so that it is relevant to their students by putting in star charts from the sky in the Southern Hemisphere. Let's think a little bit more about these OER. These are people who put a lot of time in it. Writing a book, as you know, it takes a lot of time and energy and a lot of expertise and a lot of experience as a pedagogue to write a good textbook. And people put in this time. Sometimes there are grants that were administered by the late lamented Department of Education in the United States that gave a little bit of money. I always noticed that if you actually computed the hourly wage of someone writing a brand new textbook with one of these grants, it was probably well below the minimum wage. But people did it because they believed in it, and they would spend the time to write a textbook, and students suddenly have access from the first day of the class and forever afterward to this resource for free. I worked supporting open educational resources first in the state of Colorado, at my institution, at other institutions around the United States. I do that now in many places. And the one of the things I used to tell faculty members was, this is a good that you can do that you cannot be prevented from doing. You just quietly in your office sit down and spend that time and put together, probably you have handouts and materials you've been using for years, put them together, wrap them up, make them into, do that extra work. It's a lot of extra work, but do that extra work to make it into a textbook. Find a platform where you can share it with your students, and suddenly you will have done this incredible, tangible good. Think of those students who are hungry, those students who have children who cannot buy diapers. That's a thing that students say they would do if they didn't have to spend money on expensive textbooks. And you can put that money back in their pockets. They don't have to reach for their wallet. They can instead just take the resource, get their education, pursue advancing their career as they want to by you having spent the time to do this and sharing that work that way.
So, Jonathan, how does this relate to the larger question we have here of how to resist the slide into fascism?
The image I'd like us all to have is of open education as a response that people saw to a terrible situation happening around them, which is in some sense kind of a mirror to what we were describing James Scott's Weapons of the Week. As I understood the description of Weapons of the Week, it was you are suffering of some sense of oppression and you are dragging your feet, you're working to rule, you're doing everything you can to slow down the grinding machine of oppression. And what I want to say here is this example of open education is a kind of positive example. And in the privacy of your own home or office or workplace, you can do a little bit of good. So people who are teachers can use these resources and can create more ones to share that will make the world a better place. And you don't need the approval of your employers, but you can do this good even if without it, and even in some sense quietly in the opposition to what they may be doing. So maybe there's a policy at your institution, if you're a contingent faculty member at a community college somewhere, maybe there's a policy you will use this expensive commercial statistics textbook. You can go to the first day of your class meeting, you can say to folks, hey, listen, there's another resource, here's a link to it, it's completely free, and you can have it forever, you can have it from right now. Read it on your phone, read it on your laptop, print it out if you like, and have it forever. And it costs you completely nothing. And by the way, interesting enough, I'm not going to require you to ever do any reading or any work out of the expensive book, which is in the bookstore as the required book for this course. You don't have to say, I'm violating my campus policy, but you can say, I'm not going to use that. Buy it or not, it's up to you. I'm going to use this free resource instead. So I think we can quietly, again, as Weapons of the Week taught us, we can quietly do something positive and good. Do the little things you can to make the world a better place without necessarily it being a big policy of your institution, but nevertheless, you can be effective at making a big difference in the lives of everyone who you come in contact with at your place of employment.
Jonathan, summarize it for us now. What are the things that we can do to use these open educational resources to fight fascism?
All right, I would like to say that if you're a teacher, consider trying to use one of these free, flexible resources instead of an expensive commercial resource for the benefit of you as a teacher and the benefit of your students who have to pay for it. So if you're a teacher, use those resources. If you're a learner and you want to supplement your learning, I recommend you look for an open educational resource for the material you're trying to learn. You may be able to learn just as much either on your own or as a supplementary material in a formal class by using one of these free resources. The last thing is, if you have the expertise and you have the wherewithal to do this, spend a little time to share what you create. The world is a better place if we share what we know. And as we have seen, students are suffering from financial and other burdens. And if you can spend the time to take the work that you have done and wrap it up, put it out there in the world with a Creative Commons license, We'll have some links about where you can learn about what those licenses are. Then people will be able to benefit from your work without any cost, and it will make the world a better place to share what you have created.
So it seems like the rising tide of fascism, one of the key components of it is to keep people ignorant, uneducated, ill-informed. And it seems that the attacks on educational institutions are really at the forefront of the Trump agenda and the Republican agenda because they support him. So this seems like a way of directly fighting against the attack on knowledge.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jonathan.
As always, more information is available on our website, therevolutionwillnotbetelevised.net. Thank you.